What's going on, everyone? Listen up. You already know America's big cities get all the attention when it comes to crime. Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, the usual suspects. But here's the shocking truth. According to the FBI's most recent uniform crime reporting data, you're statistically more likely to get assaulted, robbed, or even killed in dozens of small towns across the country than you are in those major metros. That's right. Communities with fewer than 50,000 people are seeing violent crime rates double, triple, even 10 times the national average. We're talking towns where 1 out of every 30 residents will experience a violent crime in a given year. Poverty, drugs, prison overflows, police shortages. It's all fueling levels of violence that most outsiders would never expect in places that look quiet from the highway. So today, we're counting down the most violent small towns in America. And trust me, by the end of this list, you'll think twice about stopping for gas in some of these so-called sleepy communities. 10. McAlester, Oklahoma. Here's the deal with McAlester. You'd think a town of around 17,000 people tucked into southeastern Oklahoma would be nothing more than a sleepy pit stop. But McAlester has earned the nickname Little Chicago of the Plains for a reason. This place was born out of the coal mining boom in the 19th century, which brought roughnecks, drifters, and every kind of outlaw looking to carve out a living or take one away. Fast forward to today, and the ghosts of that violent past are alive and well. According to the FBI's latest stats, McAlester reports about 14 violent crimes per 1,000 residents, higher than Tulsa's metro neighborhoods, even though Tulsa's population dwarfs it. That means proportionally, you're more likely to get robbed or assaulted in McAlester than in downtown Tulsa itself. One major factor? The state prison located right in town. Big Mac, as the locals call it, houses some of the most hardened criminals in Oklahoma, and gang activity spills over into the community. Shootings tied to prison gangs have shaken quiet neighborhoods, and property crime is through the roof, 88 incidents per 1,000 residents. Even local law enforcement has admitted being outnumbered and outgunned. Poverty plays its part too, with about 23% of the town living below the line. And don't overlook the opioid epidemic. McAlester has one of the highest overdose rates in the state, fueling thefts, violent confrontations, and a sense of lawlessness. So while the Chamber of Commerce will brag about the Italian festival and antique shops downtown, the reality is that McAlester is a powder keg where old outlaw history collides with modern gang wars. 9. Gallup, New Mexico. You might have heard of Gallup as a railroad stop or from Route 66 nostalgia, but let me tell you, this is not the roadside Americana dream you saw in old postcards. Gallup, population just under 22,000, is sitting right on the edge of Navajo Nation, and the town has become a magnet for crime statistics that make Albuquerque look tame by comparison. The FBI reports roughly 16 violent crimes per 1,000 residents, which puts Gallup near the top of the national charts. Assaults dominate the crime log. But here's the kicker. Gallup is infamous for one of the nation's worst public intoxication crises. More than half the arrests made by the local PD in recent years have been alcohol-related. And it feeds into everything: domestic violence, random street brawls, even assaults against police officers. Gallup's ER has been called the drunk tank of New Mexico, seeing more alcohol-related trauma cases than almost any other hospital in the state. Poverty is also crushingly high here, with nearly 30% of residents below the poverty line, and unemployment lingers around double the national average. Even worse, the highways around Gallup are considered some of the most dangerous in the entire Southwest, with fatal accidents often tied to impaired driving. Tourists stopping for a Route 66 selfie rarely realize they're in a town where the violent crime rate is more than triple the national average. And even locals will tell you, lock your doors, don't walk downtown after dark, and if you see a fight outside a liquor store, just keep driving. Gallup is a perfect storm of poverty, addiction, and underfunded law enforcement, making it one of the most volatile small towns in America. 8. Barrow, Utqiagvik, Alaska. When people imagine Barrow, now officially called Utqiagvik, they picture snowy tundras, polar bears, and maybe a quirky Alaskan community that sees 65 days of darkness in winter. What they don't picture is the town's jaw-dropping crime statistics. With fewer than 5,000 residents, Barrow has the kind of violent crime rate that would make an inner-city gang leader blush, about 20 violent crimes per 1,000 residents, putting it far above the national average. Most of these crimes are aggravated assaults and domestic violence, often fueled by alcohol despite the town's so-called damp laws that restrict sales. Locals know it's not just the isolation, it's the generational poverty, lack of infrastructure, and severe mental health crisis that drive the numbers sky high. Barrow's remoteness makes policing a nightmare. Backup could be hours away, and many officers burn out within months of arriving. Factor in the Arctic climate, where seasonal depression runs rampant, and you've got a perfect storm for violent outbreaks. Here's something most outsiders don't know. Suicide rates in this region are among the highest in the entire world, and that hopelessness spills into violent confrontations. Even basic disputes over snowmobiles or hunting rights escalate fast because in a town this isolated, everyone knows everyone's business, and grudges don't fade. Barrow's violent reputation has gotten so bad that some Alaskan travel forums bluntly advise outsiders to avoid overnight stays unless absolutely necessary. So while it may look like an adventurous bucket list destination to see the northern lights, for those who actually live in Utqiagvik, it's a place where violence has become a grim part of survival. 7. Blythe, California. Now let's talk about Blythe, a desert town of roughly 18,000 souls sitting on the Colorado River, right on the California-Arizona border. At first glance, it looks like a sleepy, sun-baked community you'd just pass on the I-10 heading to Phoenix, but Blythe has quietly built up one of the nastiest reputations in California. The violent crime rate sits around 22 incidents per 1,000 residents, which is more than 5 times higher than the state average. That's not LA gang violence, that's small-town lawlessness, and it's fueled by a cocktail of poverty, drugs, and corruption. Almost 30% of residents here live below the poverty line, and methamphetamine has been described by locals as the unofficial currency of Blythe. Police records show a shocking pattern: assaults involving weapons, high rates of domestic violence, and even violent crime connected to transient populations moving through via the interstate. Here's a detail most people miss. Blythe is home to a state prison, and a lot of ex-inmates don't leave once they're released. That has created a revolving door of criminal activity right inside the town itself. Property crimes are even worse, with over 90 incidents per 1,000 residents, making it one of the most burglary-prone towns in the entire West. The police department has been accused of being barely functional, understaffed, and struggling to deal with rising gang activity spilling over from both Phoenix and LA. So while the Chamber of Commerce will tell you Blythe is a great place for boating or farming dates in the desert, the reality is this: you've got a better chance of being robbed or assaulted in Blythe than you do in Compton. For a town this size, that's beyond alarming. 6. Pine Bluff, Arkansas. You'd think a town with a population of about 38,000 would fly under the radar, but Pine Bluff has been notorious for decades. Once known as a cotton and river trade hub, Pine Bluff has morphed into a place where crime is practically stitched into the local economy. The FBI data pegs violent crime at around 23 per 1,000 residents, and when you compare that to the national average of 4, you see just how out of hand this small city really is. Pine Bluff consistently ranks among the most dangerous towns in Arkansas, and this is a state already riddled with high-crime hot zones. A big driver here is economics. Unemployment lingers around 7%. And nearly 30% of residents live in poverty. Combine that with a staggering drop in population, Pine Bluff has lost more than 20,000 residents since the 1970s, and you've got the perfect environment for gangs and violent crime to thrive. Shootings are a weekly occurrence, and police have admitted that their resources are stretched too thin to keep up. In 2022 alone, Pine Bluff police recorded nearly 20 homicides, a murder rate higher than most major cities. The town has also been plagued by corruption scandals, with former officers indicted for drug trafficking and city funds disappearing into thin air. And here's a detail most people don't realize. Pine Bluff is home to a federal correctional facility and a slew of halfway houses which feed into the already stressed local policing system. So while the town likes to highlight its rich blues music history and museums, the reality is that Pine Bluff is a place where you don't just worry about being robbed, you worry about surviving the week. 5. East St. Louis, Illinois. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't East St. Louis practically part of the St. Louis Metro? Technically, yes, but it's its own city of barely 18,000 people. And when it comes to violent crime, East St. Louis is in a league of its own. For decades, this town has been held up as an example of urban decay, and FBI numbers show violent crime rates soaring past 25 per 1,000 residents. That's about 6 times the national average, and some years the murder rate here has outpaced Chicago by a wide margin. The reason? Generational poverty and catastrophic government mismanagement. Nearly half the population lives below the poverty line, unemployment is among the worst in the nation, and the city has been in financial freefall for years. Police staffing levels are so low that in some neighborhoods, response times can be hours. Shootings, carjackings, and armed robberies aren't just common, they're expected. One terrifying stat: in 2020, the murder rate hit 101 per 100,000 residents, making East St. Louis the deadliest city per capita in the entire United States. Locals joke darkly that the only thing lower than property values is life expectancy. Schools are chronically underfunded, infrastructure is collapsing, and the city's leadership has been caught in corruption scandals time and again. And here's something that flies under the radar. East St. Louis sits on key drug trafficking routes across the Mississippi River, making it a prime battlefield for gangs. If you ask residents, they'll tell you the violence is baked into daily life. You hear gunshots like clockwork at night. While St. Louis across the river is dangerous, East St. Louis magnifies that danger in a concentrated small-town setting where crime feels inescapable. 4. Danville, Illinois. Let's stay in Illinois for a second because Danville deserves its own spotlight. Population around 28,000, and yet its violent crime stats rival cities 10 times its size. FBI data shows a violent crime rate of roughly 28 per 1,000 residents, nearly 7 times the national average. But here's the thing: Danville doesn't look like a war zone. Downtown has old theaters, brick buildings, and the charm of a Midwest small city. But behind the facade, crime is absolutely rampant. Aggravated assaults make up the majority, but robberies and homicides are disturbingly common. One stat that shocks outsiders: Danville's homicide rate has been as high as 20 per 100,000, putting it in the same category as Detroit. And just like other towns on this list, poverty is a massive driver. About 27% of residents live below the poverty line, and economic opportunities have evaporated since the factories shut down decades ago. Methamphetamine and opioids have ravaged entire neighborhoods, creating violent clashes between users, dealers, and the desperate. Local police have admitted they're overwhelmed, especially after multiple officers left for better-paying departments in bigger cities. And here's something you won't see on a tourist brochure. Danville has been ranked as one of the worst cities in America for youth crime, with gang recruitment happening right in high schools. Car thefts, shootings, and burglaries all spike during the summer, and longtime residents will tell you they don't let their kids play outside after dark anymore. The sad part is, Danville was once known for its jazz history and as the hometown of Dick Van Dyke. Now it's better known as a place where crime outpaces opportunity, and the small-town charm comes with a side of bullet holes in abandoned buildings. 3. Camden, Arkansas. Now, Arkansas shows up again, and for good reason. Camden, a small town of just under 10,000 residents in southern Arkansas, looks like a sleepy old paper mill community on the Ouachita River. But don't let the postcard riverfront fool you. This place is one of the most violent towns per capita in the state. FBI data puts violent crime at roughly 30 per 1,000 residents, meaning you're dealing with rates that are nearly 8 times the national average. That's staggering. Camden's history tells the story. Once a bustling hub for timber and manufacturing, it has been gutted by job losses, leaving poverty at nearly 35% of the population. What fills that vacuum? Drugs, gangs, and desperation. Methamphetamine labs have been raided regularly in nearby rural areas, and a large chunk of that trade filters back into Camden, bringing violent disputes right onto residential streets. Shootings often happen in broad daylight, and aggravated assaults are practically weekly news headlines. One little-known detail: Camden sits near major freight rail lines, and police reports note that transient criminal activity spikes whenever large shipments move through. Combine that with a severely underfunded police department, and you've got a recipe for chaos. In 2021, Camden even made state headlines after officers reported being outnumbered during gang shootouts, something you'd expect in Los Angeles, not a small Arkansas town. Even locals admit they sleep with their doors locked and their lights on, and for good reason. Camden is proof that rural America can be every bit as violent as the inner city, sometimes even more so. 2. Bessemer, Alabama. Bessemer is one of those towns where the numbers speak louder than anything else. Population, about 26,000. Violent crime rate, an eye-watering 34 per 1,000 residents. That's nearly 9 times higher than the national average. To put it bluntly, you're safer walking the streets of Chicago at night than you are in Bessemer on a Tuesday afternoon. Historically, Bessemer was a steel town, but when the steel industry collapsed, so did the economy. Today, nearly 30% of residents live in poverty, and unemployment is consistently among the highest in Alabama. That's the backdrop for a violent crime scene dominated by robberies, shootings, and aggravated assaults. But here's a detail most people outside Alabama don't know. Bessemer has become a hub for prison-related crime. The William Donaldson Correctional Facility sits just outside town, and violence tied to prison gangs spills into neighborhoods. Add in drug trafficking routes along I-59, and you've got a hotbed of organized street violence in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. In 2022 alone, Bessemer logged more than 600 violent crimes, an insane number for such a small population. Local law enforcement has admitted they can't keep up, with officers stretched so thin that entire neighborhoods report waiting hours for backup during emergencies. And then there's the corruption. Several city officials have been investigated for pocketing funds meant for crime prevention programs. So while Birmingham nearby gets all the headlines, Bessemer quietly racks up stats that make it one of the most dangerous small towns in the nation. This is not the kind of place you pull over to grab gas. You fuel up before you hit the city limits and keep on driving. 1. Monroe, Louisiana. At the very top of the list, we've got Monroe, Louisiana. And make no mistake, this one earns the crown. Population around 47,000. But the violent crime rate sits at an unbelievable 36 per 1,000 residents. That means in Monroe, your odds of being the victim of violent crime are higher than almost anywhere else in America. This isn't just bad luck, it's systemic. Monroe is a city that's been trapped in cycles of poverty, corruption, and neglect for decades. Roughly 35% of residents live below the poverty line, one of the highest rates in the entire country, and unemployment regularly spikes above national averages. Drugs dominate the streets here, particularly meth and crack cocaine, feeding violent turf wars between dealers and desperate users. In 2022, Monroe logged more than 1,700 violent crimes, including nearly 500 aggravated assaults, and the murder rate has rivaled New Orleans at times. Even more shocking, Monroe has consistently ranked among the top 5 most dangerous cities in America overall, not just among small towns. Police here face constant struggles, from officer shortages to outdated equipment, and many locals complain that 911 response times are so slow they might as well not bother calling. Beyond the crime, infrastructure is collapsing. Abandoned buildings become breeding grounds for crime, and entire neighborhoods look like ghost towns. A stat most people don't know: Monroe has one of the highest rates of juvenile arrests for violent crimes in the country, meaning the next generation is already locked into the cycle. So while the town has a rich cultural history, with bayou culture and Southern charm woven into its DNA, the reality is harsh. Monroe is ground zero for small-town violence in America, and until its deep-rooted issues are addressed, it will keep topping lists like this one. And there you have it, the most violent small towns in America. What's wild is that these aren't huge cities with millions of people. These are places where everybody knows everybody, yet the crime rates are off the charts. It proves one thing: danger doesn't always come from skylines and freeways. It can hide behind white picket fences, quiet streets, and a friendly welcome sign at the city limits. The FBI says violent crime overall in the U.S. has dipped slightly in the last couple years, but in towns like these, it's rising, and the numbers aren't just statistics. They're families, neighbors, and communities stuck in cycles that feel impossible to break. So the next time you hear someone say small-town America is always safe, remember this list and ask yourself, do we really know what's happening behind those closed doors?